Dante and the Journey of Love, Pilgrimage in Renaissance Art by Elizabeth Lev. There are few examples of love as concrete as pilgrimage, traveling to be with family on holidays, flying to the side of a loved one in difficulty. The voyage for someone or something special, with its physical toll, expense, and time, are sincere manifestations of caring among human beings. By the time of Dante Alighieri in the 14th century, pilgrimage was recognized as something very special. It could be fraught with danger, hardship. It was expensive. It was long. And it was often used as a way to fulfill a vow and give thanksgiving for a grace received. Or, given the dangers of attack and sickness that pilgrims would often encounter, it could be a penance for a grave sin. Dante Alighieri framed his epic poem, The Divine Comedy, in terms of pilgrimage. Dante himself had been a pilgrim during the very first Christian Jubilee year in 1300, and indeed, the story of the Divine Comedy, Dante's three-day journey through the Inferno, the Purgatory, and Heaven, takes place over Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Easter Sunday of Jubilee year 1300. Inspired by Homer and Virgil and the epic narratives told by the Greek and the Roman, Dante also told a great adventure story. But his story, framed in the historical struggles of medieval Europe, talking about Christian virtue and sin, it was rendered more accessible to his own contemporary audience, an audience that was growing accustomed to learning and finding delight through stories. Dante's word painted pictures in the minds of his readers, just as his contemporary and fellow Florentine Giotto was developing new ways to tell stories on the two-dimensional surface of walls. Both men, interestingly, were members of the Third Order of the brand new Franciscans, recently founded by St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis had renewed the art of preaching with a passionate, accessible style. He used vivid examples drawn from everyday human experience. The power of words and images to stimulate the imagination and piety was a fundamental step in the development of Renaissance art. Dante transformed the epic journeys of Greek heroes into the faithful's search for God, while Giotto used the volume, the organization of antique art, and observation of his fellow citizens to breathe life into the painted figures of these ancient stories. Dante's stories and Giotto's pictures thrilled Europe for a few decades, but after a while, the initial interest began to dwindle, and Dante's Divine Comedy became much more of a blueprint for artists to represent images particularly of hell. Chapels, altarpieces, and entire fresco cycles were dedicated to the imagery of crime and punishment as laid out in Dante's Inferno. These were meant to be stern warnings to the local populace that would look upon those images daily, weekly inside the churches, that the sins committed but not expiated in this life would be fully accountable in the afterlife. In a great many cities and towns, Dante's images became a vivid catalogue of the besetting sins of the age. The emphasis was on greed, lust, usury, gluttony, images that were meant to speak to the people of wealthy towns, learning to enjoy themselves with a great many pleasures. Artists made great images of justice in this age, but mercy seemed a little scarce. As the Renaissance reached its zenith in the late 15th century, artists began to explore more of the Divine Comedy than merely the warnings against sin. Taken by the belief that beauty led to truth and ultimately to God, they began to perceive that that desire for beauty was an indication and a road to love. Sandro Botticelli, the lyrical painter of the Primavera and the birth of Venus, may be best known to us for these pagan myths, but he spent many years of his life focusing on illustrating the Divine Comedy. This inspired effort, effectively the first time an artist of such a high caliber had attempted to illustrate the entire Divine Comedy, was the fruit of a shared vision between the painter Sandro Botticelli and a remarkable member of the Medici family, Lorenzo di Pier Francesco, believed to be also the person who commissioned Botticelli's famous Primavera. Working on and off for a span of about 25 years, Botticelli completed 92 drawings out of the projected 100, a drawing for each of Dante's cantos. He only managed to add color to 4 of these images. Botticelli's images are more complete when illustrating the Inferno, which is where he began the project, and his use of color is very bright and striking. As Botticelli illustrated the Purgatory and eventually the Paradise, his silver point drawings grow lighter and the figures become more flowing and more ethereal, reminiscent of his famous works, Primavera and the Birth of Venus. The Paradise is marked by geometrical compositions and figures that become lovely with their soft robes and flowing hair. That loveliness reveals the true message of the Divine Comedy, the message of love. Dante had always claimed that his poem was about love. He was trained in the courtly style of love poetry, and he brought that element into his epic comedy. His love of Beatrice and the beauty of language drew him to the beauty of the beatific vision. At the very end of the Divine Comedy, Dante reaches the presence of God, accompanied by the Blessed Virgin. At his glimpse of the Lord's majesty, words fail him, but he recognizes that what he has seen is pure love. And the last line he wrote of this great poem, in even motion, by the love impelled, that moves the sun in the heaven and all the stars. The 16th century did little with the Divine Comedy. It became a tale to be told in the great courts of Europe, preferably by a native Tuscan. Leonardo da Vinci was famously brought to Amboise in France by King Francis I. His job description? To read the Divine Comedy in his native accent. And then along came Michelangelo. By the 1530s, the Protestant Reformation had rent the church in pieces. Conflict over the sacraments, cooperation in salvation, and division among cardinals and bishops had left the church reeling. A new painting, commissioned for the Sistine Chapel in 1534, was intended to focus attention on the ultimate goal of humanity, being face to face with the Lord. To visually speak theological truth to the power struggles of the age, Pope Paul III called in the 57-year-old Michelangelo Florentine, and said by the Zari to have the Divine Comedy memorized by heart, Michelangelo gave the most extraordinary visual interpretation of Dante's epic poem. Michelangelo's Last Judgment, placed on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, a very unusual place to put such an image, has no architectural framework. It simply looks like the wall dissolves into this scene of heaven and hell. This illustrated the space of the chapel as a microcosm of a journey, the common human pilgrimage to our ultimate destiny, Christ. Michelangelo, instead of detailing the individual sections of Dante's Divine Comedy, englobed the great epic poem into a vision of Dante, pilgrimage, beauty, and love. The shape of the fresco resembles the tablets of the Ten Commandments, the law given to Moses by the Lord himself that must be followed. The theme of justice present in all the earlier versions of the Inferno was not ignored, but Michelangelo chose not to focus on individual sins, but on salvation. Michelangelo was not just an expert on Dante, he was also a poet himself, and he selected 3 scenes from the Divine Comedy to employ in his colossal fresco of the Last Judgment. The first comes from the Inferno, and he painted the ferryman Charon, whose task it is to row the souls across the river Styx to their eternal punishment. The souls occasionally are reluctant to leave the boat, at which point the duty of the boatman becomes to beat them off the boat with his oar. Michelangelo interprets the scene very powerfully, the lone Charon winding back with the oar in his hands, the souls clustered in the center, the fear, the terror that paralyzes them, and then those who have been forced off the boat leaping into the arms of the awaiting demons and torments. Michelangelo's second allusion to Dante came in the form of a witty retort to an early critic. Biagio da Cesena, the master of ceremonies to Pope Paul III, had complained about the nudity in Michelangelo's fresco, and claimed that the work of this great master was not fit for a papal chapel, but rather for public baths and taverns. Michelangelo responded by painting Biagio da Cesena in hell as Midas, the judge, who on earth, having poorly evaluated the music of the god Apollo, wore ears of a donkey, and in hell he indicated the level of torment for the sinners brought before him by wrapping his snake-like tail around his waist. Biagio da Cesena immediately went to complain to the Pope, resulting in one of the most entertaining comebacks in the history of the papacy. Pope Paul III, upon being told he must get Michelangelo to remove him from the painting, answered, "The Pope can get you out of purgatory, but he can do nothing about hell." Michelangelo used a more subtle allusion to Dante, still in the lower part of the fresco, as he represented a soul contested between an angel and a demon. This comes from the Purgatory, where in Canto 5, a man who had lived violently and who had died violently, at the very last moment, invoked the name of the Virgin Mary. And as the life left his body, he felt his soul pulled up by an angel, at which point a demon grasped him, listing the number of his sins. But the invocation to the Blessed Virgin meant that the angel would win. And in this image, Michelangelo opens up an important door in this painting, the image and the reminder of hope. Hope in salvation. Like Dante, Michelangelo believed that beauty was a true path to the Lord. And just as the language of the poet grows more musical as he rises towards the heavens and his descriptions become more awe-inspiring, so Michelangelo had the forms of his figures grow in beauty as they resurrected from the ground and became closer and closer to heaven. His figures grow larger, more luminous, more exquisite, the best that his mind and brush could muster, a beauty to herald salvation. Ultimately, love is the goal of our pilgrimage, the glorious image of the Trinity, which is love. Dante, after making his long journey, arrives at the very end of his trip, but is unable to gaze alone upon the image of the living Lord. He needs help, just as we need help. How to make that last leap, how to help us gaze upon the glory of Christ, we look to the Virgin Mary. In Canto 33, Saint Bernard intervenes to help Dante, asking the Blessed Virgin to assist his gaze to be able to absorb the highest pleasure. It is perhaps this, the greatest lesson that Michelangelo drew from Dante, the role of the Blessed Virgin. Michelangelo's Jesus, beautiful, powerful, glorious, but aloof. His face turned away. The gesture you notice first seems to sweep us from his presence. But when we look more closely, when we bring ourselves in the intimate presence of the scene, we notice Mary, curled by the side of Christ, by the wound from which in his passion the church came. Jesus' gentle gesture frames that wound, and through Mary, the viewer is drawn into he who is love. Jesus, who loved the world so much that he sacrificed himself to redeem them, now, through his mother, brings us in to partake of that complete giving love. The Renaissance gave us the most beautiful vision of pilgrimage, the ultimate destiny to be united with Christ in love. The words of Dante set to the art of Michelangelo.